John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we read in Hellblazer number 69. And just a little catch up on what was going on in the last issue. We saw the fallout from Kit and John's breakup, and John is now living on the streets because he is so depressed. All he wants to do all day is get drunk and not think about Kit leaving him or even Chaz getting mad and beating him up. So that's how he's been spending his days, panhandling, just so he can get enough to buy some liquor to make all his memories go away. We also saw the reintroduction of the King of the Vampires and two of his minions. They just happened to be in London as well. And while the King of the Vampires was out one night stalking, he caught whiff of John Constantine, and he found John asleep with a young man named Davy, who's also homeless, in an abandoned house. And that is where we left off with issue 68. So first things first, with 69, we got the cover. We see the King of the Vampires is looking like he's about to bite us. And behind him, we're seeing like a collage of gas masks, and then also barbed wire in front of him. And there's a couple bloody hands reaching up like they're asking for help. And as we turn the page, we get a little history with the King of the Vampires, where he's talking about the first time he ever drank the blood of a Constantine. And the flashback starts on a battlefield in World War I, and the narration of the King of the Vampires says, "I remember my first Constantine. It was the 1st of July, 1916, and the night was deep and blue and beautiful. 20,000 men lay dead or dying in the scarlands of the Somme. It was paradise, nirvana. I hardly knew where to begin. I walked through the corpse garden that had been the Manchester Fusiliers, reveling in sobs and moans and cries to God or Mother, and I thought, this day, this glorious day, there is a God after all." Then we zoom in on a lone man who's alive in the battlefield, and the narration continues. "But for Lance Corporal William Constantine, it was just the day that all his pals went down." So young William Constantine is kind of on his knees crying in the battlefield. He's still holding his rifle, and all of a sudden he hears someone call out, "Sergeant." So William gets up and he walks towards the sound, and as he gets over the top of a small hill, and he sees the man who was calling out, and he says, "Ken?" And as William goes closer to Ken, Ken sees him and says, "Sergeant Private Wilson, reporting for duty, Sergeant." And as William stands over him, he says, "Fletcher's copped it, Ken. It's me. It's Bill." And this whole time, we've only seen the top half of Ken, but we get a zoomed out panel where we see Ken saying, "I'm thirsty." And we see that he is missing both of his legs from just above the knee down. So William sees his friend dying and he says, I'll get you a drink, Ken." And as William walks away to look for a canteen, Ken whispers, "Thirsty." So as William looks around for a canteen on some of the other bodies, we see the shadow of a man appear next to Ken. But we keep following William, so we don't see what happens with Ken and that man. And as William finds a canteen on a dead body, the narration continues saying, "He found water on a dead Inniskilling." And I had to look that word up because Inniskilling is not something I've ever heard of, but apparently that is a special branch of the Irish infantry. And the narration continues. "Bill was nothing special. Whatever it was that slithered around his family tree had passed him by completely. He joined up to fight for king and country like a bloody fool. and now all he wanted was to be back on the Liverpool docks with Alice and little Tom waiting for him at home. So as William brings back the canteen of water to his friend Ken, he crests that hill one more time, and as Ken comes into view, he stops dead in his tracks and says, "Ken?" And then we see what scared William so bad, and we see he's looking at someone, another soldier, biting the neck of Ken. And then the person biting Ken raises his gaze to William, and they both lock eyes, and we see his face all bloody and everything, and this is the King of the Vampires. And the second they look at each other, William rushes forward with his bayonet attached to his rifle and yells, "Freaking bastard!" And he stabs the King of the Vampires directly in the heart. And the King of the Vampires isn't moved at all. He looks down at the blade, and then he looks back up at William with a smile on his face, and William's face goes from angry to terrified in that moment. And the narration continues. "I opened his throat with my little finger and watched him gape and choke while his life came out in a spurt. 5 or 6 seconds. Then we cut to present day, where we're exactly at the moment that we ended with in the last issue, where the King of the Vampires is standing over John Constantine and Davy sleeping on the bed in the abandoned house. And he's looking at them with a smile on his face, just like he had when William stabbed him. And as he looks at John asleep, his narration says, "I'll take my time with this one." And we see the name of this issue is Rough Trade, and it is written by Garth Ennis with art by Steve Dillon. And as we turn the page, we see John Constantine begins to wake up, and as we zoom out, we see that the King of the Vampires is nowhere to be seen at the moment. And as John wakes up, he says, "What's the freaking time?" And him waking up seems to have woken up Davy as well, and Davy says to him, "Don't know. Did I wake you?" And as John replies, "No," Davy continues, "I can't sleep, man. I feel sick. I don't know what's the matter with me." And then he gets out of the bed and stands up, and Davy says, "Going for a walk." And then John begins to get up, and he says, "I'll come with you. Anything to drink?" And then Davy pulls a bottle out, and he says, "I nicked a bottle of gin from that prick earlier. You coming or what?" And as Davy shakes the bottle at him, John says, "It's my tipple." And then John reaches out and takes the bottle from Davy, and then he proceeds to take a big gulp out of the bottle. And as he does this, Davy begins to rub his neck and says, "Bloody nightmares and all." And then as John finishes his big gulp, he offers the bottle back to Davy, and Davy says, "Jesus, no. I'd puke me ring. I can't take much more of this frickin' life, man. I'll be lucky if my bollocks don't freeze off by New Year." And John asks, "What are you going to do?" And Davy replies, "Don't know. Maybe hitch back up to Sheffield?" And John says, "No work there either, mate." And then Davy begins to rub his neck again, and he says, "Nah, but I've got a mate who works at the lead mill. It's a nightclub like. He might fix me up." "Jesus, me neck." And then John asks, "What's the matter with your neck?" And Davy answers, "Don't know. It's been killing me since I woke up. Hurts worse than me guts. And I feel really weak and tired." So John moves closer to him and says, "Give us a look." And then we get a panel of the King of the Vampires smiling on, watching this scene through a broken window. And as John pulls back the collar of Davy's jacket, he sees the 2 puncture marks, and he knows exactly what happened. And he says, "Friggin' Jesus, take your coat off." And Davy is confused, and he says, "What?" And John yells again, "Take it off." So Davy begins to remove his jacket, and we see on his white undershirt that there was a bunch of blood that is pooled on his chest and arm and shoulder. And as this is revealed, he's kind of staring at John with worry. And then from the shadows, we see the King of the Vampires snap his fingers, and all of a sudden, blood begins to spurt and gush from Davy's neck. And Davy looks at John and then falls to the ground, and he reaches out to John as he's bleeding out in front of him. And John is just staring at this in horror, and he does raise his hand to reach out to Davy, but obviously he can't do anything about this, and Davy dies in front of him. Then John turns as he hears someone say, "Good one, eh?" Then we cut to the London Bridge, where Mary and Darius are waiting for the King of the Vampires to get back, because he had told them to meet him back here an hour before sunset in the last issue. And Darius is saying, "Where is he? An hour from dawn," he said. "It'll be sunup in 20 friggin' minutes." And Mary, who's less worried, says, "He's probably gotten sidetracked. You know what he's like. Come on, Darius. He'll catch up. Let's go below." But Darius doesn't move, and he says, "You go." And Mary's kind of taken aback by this, and she smiles at him and says, You really love him, don't you? And as Darius looks out over the city, he turns his head back to Mary and says, He gave me this life, Mary. He's more than my lover and my king. He's my friend. Then we cut back to John and the King of the Vampires, and they are standing facing each other now with Davy's body on the ground in the middle. And the King of the Vampires asks John, Friend of yours? And John replies, Must be. He's dead. And the King of the Vampires laughs and says, He had AIDS, you know. I can taste it in the blood. Were you screwing him? And John doesn't answer. He just brings the bottle up to his lips and begins to drink. And the King of the Vampires says, Well, in about 10 minutes, it won't matter anyway. And as John pounds the liquor from the bottle, the King of the Vampires brings up the last conversation they had from issue 50, when at the end of it, John had said that the reason why he doesn't want to be a vampire is because he wants to feel the sun on his face and listen to the birds sing in the morning and kiss a girl that he loves. So the King of the Vampires remembers that conversation and looks at John downing this bottle of alcohol in John's rough appearance, and he says, So what happened to the joys of real life then? Not listening to the birds sing or watching the sun come up? Can't you kiss a girl and know she loves you anymore? And that last line hit John pretty hard because obviously Kit just left him and that's what he's trying to forget. So he looks down at the ground like he's very sad, and the King of the Vampires continues, Of course not. That's always the problem with you people. And then he begins to walk towards John and he says, All these aspirations to greatness, to a world of peace and perfect beauty. You try so hard to deny yourselves, don't you? Hypocrites. And then he reaches John and stands behind him and puts his hand on John's shoulders as he continues saying, You're worse than animals. Your instincts revolve around fear. You hate, you covet, you cause centuries of agony, and all because you're scared to trust the other guy. Your fear is a palpable thing, John. You wear it like a second skin. I should know. I killed the first man on Earth, and believe me, he was dripping with it. Then we get a cool little flashback panel of him killing the first man. Then we cut back to present day and we see the King of the Vampires lets go of John's shoulder and walks away nonchalantly as he continues saying, And before you accuse me of planting poison apples in your spiritual garden, let me point out that 2 hours before I found him, the idiot killed his eldest son in an argument over a mango. And during this whole speech, John is just looking down at the ground sad and not saying anything, and the King of the Vampires continues. The best thing about it is, it's going to be your undoing. We drink the blood of humanity, but you drink the blood of the planet. I watch you try to deal with it. Hilarious. The people with the power can't be bothered, and the people who give them the power can't even see it. You're killing your world, and you're doing it with apathy and stupid jokes about suntans. Her seas are poison, her lands are barren, her skies are ragged veils that will soon burn away altogether. We'll all be in the same boat then, won't we? Terrified of the sun, you'll come running underground, out of the light, and guess who'll be waiting? And at this last line, we see the look on John's face go from sadness to contempt, and he begins to side-eye the King of the Vampires. And the King of the Vampires sees this and gives John a smile and says, You know there are signs up in Canada and Australia warning people not to sunbathe? All the things you were told about 5 years ago. That sounded like a science fiction nightmare your children would be facing. And then John cuts him off saying, It's already happening. And the King of the Vampires nods in agreement and says, Personally, I can't wait for the end of the world. Not this world. 20 billion years from now, when this place is eaten by its cooling sun, I'll just go and find another one, and another, and another. But eventually, when the universe eats itself and everything ends, when physical life is over, and all that's left is the spirit, where there's nowhere to go but the lake of fire or the fields of paradise, well, we'll still live, but we'll do what we never could before, what even one of my children dreams of. Sleep in peace. Then John cuts in saying, suppose you've lived on other worlds before you came to this one? And the king of the vampires nods and says, mm-hmm. And John continues, and all you've managed to do is kill people? That's brilliant, that is. And the king of the vampires jokingly looks at John and says, haven't we already covered this? I'm more interested in why, even though I lived on other worlds before I came to this one, I've always looked like James Dean. But enough about me. Do you want to be a vampire? And John answers, no, I'm not that low. Just kill me. And then the king of the vampires moves his face really close to John, and as he does this, he whispers, hypocrite. And then he bites into John's neck, sending John toppling backwards with the king of the vampires on top of him. And John's narration says, so this is it. And I'm going to snuff it so fast I can't even think about it. Not that I have a sober brain cell left to think with. And we see that John is yelling out in pain as the king vampire begins to drink from his neck. But then all of a sudden, the king of the vampires backs away really quickly and says, what's... And then he stands up off of John and he grabs his mouth and he says, and John is watching this as he rolls from his back to his hands and knees. And then he realizes what's happening. And we see the narration say, demon blood. And then John begins to laugh incessantly as the king of the vampires runs around in pain, grabbing the bottom of his face. And we can see that blood is starting to come out from where his hand is grabbing on his lower chin. And the king is yelling, And then John finds the bottle of gin that was on the ground next to Davy, and he continues laughing as he takes a really big drink from it. Then he walks over as the king of the vampires falls to the ground, and we see now that his hand is away from his face, his jaw is basically melting away. And John says to him, ha ha ha, king of the vampires. Then he unzips his pants, and he starts pissing all over the king of the vampires as he's on the ground. And he says once again, king of the friggin' vampires. Then John notices that the sun is rising above a house just over his shoulder, and he begins to laugh even harder. And the king of the vampires also sees the sun about to rise, and he begins to try to crawl to a more covered area of the dilapidated house. But John does not let him. He actually walks over to the king of vampires, who's crawling very slowly towards this opening, and he grabs him by the foot, and he says, come here, you bastard. And he pulls the king of the vampires out into the open sunlight just as it crests the roof of the house. And the king of the vampires is struggling, saying, "Ugh." And then he looks in terror as the sun rays touch his face. And as we turn the page, we see the king of the vampires burst into flames. And John does a fist pump in the air as he celebrates. Then he brings the bottle up to his lips, and his narration says, and I drink. It tastes of evil, hatred, spite, cruelty, sadism. It tastes of screwing the other bastard good and proper. It tastes of winning. And I drain it to the last friggin' drop. And this page right here is one of my favorite pages of all time in Hellblazer, because the look on his face as it says last friggin' drop is just insane. It's just pure evil happiness. And it's the look John gets on his face every time he bests one of these big bad demons or monsters. Then we cut back to the vampire's cave where Darius and Mary are waiting, and it seems that both of them definitely felt the death of the king of the vampires, because Mary is doubling over in pain, and she's saying, Darius, he's... And Darius looks at her and begins to cry, and she says, oh Lord, oh my dear Lord, whatever he ran into up there, to destroy him? I mean, oh Lord above us all, I don't like to think about it. And then Darius turns from her and he begins to walk up to the opening of the cave. And she turns to him and says, Darius, what are you doing? And without looking back, he says to her, I'm just going outside and maybe some time. So basically, Darius is just going to kill himself because he can't take a world without the king of the vampires, who, as he said earlier, is his lover, his king, and his best friend. Then we cut back to John, who is now passed out next to his empty bottle of booze, and some people are talking, saying, Kennel, look at the state of him. And Kennel replies, oh, Jesus, blood everywhere. And this actually rouses John, and he says, what? And he's actually laying like around a corner, so he can't see who's talking, but he gets up and he kind of leans against the wall, and he peeks around it, and he sees two police officers looking at the body of Davy on the ground, with all the blood around him, and one of them saying, "Someone's taking a bleeding great chunk out of his neck. Bleeding tramps will do anything to each other, won't they?" And the other one replies, "Here, isn't he that bum boy we nicked down at Tottenham Court? He is." And John gets very angered by this, and he yells out, "Frickin' queer and all, wankers!" And then he throws his bottle at the officers, which crashes down at their feet, and one of them yells out, "Shit!" And then John continues to yell at them, saying, "Pair of bloody pig bastards! Eat shit! Eat frickin' shit!" And then they begin to move towards John, and he yells back at them with his fists in the air, "Come on, you friggers! Come on!" And the officers take out their billy clubs, and they begin to beat John until he's unconscious on the ground. And one of them yells at him, "Now who's the wanker, huh? Now who's the frickin' wanker?" And we don't know how long John was passed out, but as we turn the page, we see him walking on the sidewalks, and as he passes people, people are looking at him like he smells, they don't want to touch him. Then he goes into one of his old corner stores, and as he enters, the lady behind the counter says, "Oh, bloody hell." And John reaches into his pocket to get some coins, and he holds them out to her and says, "Give us a buck fast." And the woman behind the counter takes the money, and then she looks at John as she's putting the bottle in a paper sack, and it looks like she recognizes him because she says, Are you John Constantine? Did you used to come in here for Silk Cut?" Which is the brand of cigarettes John smokes. And John answers her, "Nah, that's someone else." And he looks very sad as he says this last line. Then we cut to him outside and it begins pouring rain, but he's got his bottle now and he begins to drink from it. And the narration says, "So he goes back to his cold, sick life on stone and iron, his piss from the sky and his brick wall endings, so he can crawl and shit and not have to think about how he could have flown." Then we see John walk by another pair of homeless people on the street, and the narration continues. "Thousands more like him. Thousands more tough old lives who couldn't hack out their slice of the pie. Frigate. At the end of the day, words aren't enough, and they never are. Believe me." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And I don't know about you guys, but I thought that the King of the Vampires was going to be much more of a long, drawn-out storyline, because he definitely seemed like one of those big bad characters. And I really like the way that when he's defeated, John all of a sudden gets cocky again. He kind of comes back to his old self. And even though it's just for a moment, because he goes back to his new depressed self, it was just really fun to see. So we'll have to see what happens in the next issue. But until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.